have to look at Greece, where there won't be much to eat of any sort. A week ago, a group of very high-profile progressive economists, Stiglitz et al., wrote an open letter to German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying right now the Greek government is being asked to put a gun to its head and pull the trigger. And the past week hasn't changed that scenario. Greece went very close to pulling that trigger when it went to Brussels with a suite of suggestions that many saw as capitulation and a betrayal of the previous week's no vote in the referendum. But as we've heard, a third bailout deal has been struck to keep Greece within the Eurozone, and already the Labour Minister has denounced the terms and reported that the conditions are so tough, so rough, that it poses a perhaps impossible political task for the Prime Minister. Former Finance Minister, our old friend Yanis Varoufakis, joins me now for his first post-resignation interview. Now, I've got to ask you this, Yanis. Did you jump or were you pushed?
Something in between. I jumped more than I was pushed. On the night of the referendum, Philip, I entered the Prime Ministerial office elated. I was travelling on a beautiful cloud, pushed by the beautiful winds of the public's enthusiasm for the victory of Greek democracy during that referendum. The moment I entered the Prime Ministerial office, I sensed immediately a certain sense of resignation, a negatively charged atmosphere. And I was confronted with an air of defeat, which was completely at odds with what was happening outside. And at that point, I had to put it to the Prime Minister, if you want to use the buzz of democracy outside the gates of this splendid building, you can count on me. But if, on the other hand, you feel you cannot manage, you cannot handle this majestic no to a rather irrational proposition from our European partners, then I'm going to simply steal into the night. And I could see that he didn't have an attitude. He didn't have what it took sentimentally, emotionally at that moment to carry that no vote to Europe, to use it as a weapon. So in the best of possible spirits, the two of us get on remarkably well and will continue to get on, I hope. I decided to give him the leeway that he needs in order to go back to Brussels and strike what he knows to be an impossible deal, a deal that is simply not viable.
Is that why you've disappeared from public view since?
Yes, I thought that the best support I could offer the Prime Minister and my dear colleague Euclid Tsakalotos, who succeeded me in the Ministry of Finance, was to keep quiet, to send them my best regards and my comradely wishes, with some pieces of advice regarding particularly the kind of debt restructure that the country needs as a minimum requirement for retaining its hope for the future, and to keep quiet while they were having a terrible time, an inhumanly terrible time in these meetings. I know very well what it feels like to walk inside those neon-lit, heartless rooms full of apparatchiks and bureaucrats who have absolutely no interest in the human cost of decision-making, and to have to struggle against them in order to come back with something that is palatable.
You've paid a very heavy personal price. It's been quite extraordinary watching your political enemies in Europe focus on you again and again and again and hammer away at you with every tool in the box.
Well, I had to pay the price, Philip. I'm quite happy to have paid that price. I paid it with pride. of having killed the Troika. I remember one of the first meetings that I had in office was with the president of the Eurogroup, Mr. Jeroen Dijsselbloem. And when I explained in public, in the press conference that followed our meeting, that Greece would no longer be subject to the invasions in our ministries of technocrats hell-bent on determining the minutiae of every policy that is decided in Greece, I was told in no uncertain terms that I had just crossed the line. And there was a public display of discord between us when he leant into my office and he whispered, "You just killed the Troika." And I responded, "I'm very glad to have done this. This is why I was elected." And from that moment onwards, it became clear to me that I would...
Sorry, I interrupted, but will you stay in politics?
Of course I will. The decision to enter politics was a difficult one, but I had to look at the electors in the eye and say to them that now that I'm taking this plunge, I'm not a fair weather sailor. I'm going to be here for the course, and I'm going to represent you through thick and thin. And in essence, I'm actually very much enjoying being a backbencher at the moment, Philip, because I have a lot more room for maneuver and speaking the truth without having to worry about phrasing the truth in diplomatic terms. Not that I did much of that, but now I don't even have to try. And I was rewarded with 145,000 votes. I got the most votes of any member of parliament in Greece last January, and I'm going to honor these 140,000 people.
Oliver Hartwich was on the programme the other night arguing that Greece should never have joined the EU with the wisdom of hindsight. Do you agree?
Well, not just with hindsight. In the late 1990s, even though I was living in Australia, in Sydney, if you recall, I was waging a campaign against Greece's entering the Eurozone. The argument, that argument has never faded. I've always made the point that whereas it is extremely foolhardy and tough to get out of the Eurozone is not a member to which we would have belonged in the first place. And by the way, I did hear the Hartwich interview, and you introduced him by saying that he would probably offer a very different view to mine, but in the end he didn't.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I go back to that strange meeting with your Prime Minister and his negativity. There is an argument, oft stated, that he wasn't expecting a no vote.
Well, I have to say that I wasn't expecting a no vote either. Let me be clear on this. I knew that the moment we announced the referendum on that Friday night, that if a referendum were to take place that night or the day after, we would have won decisively. But we also knew that the central bank, instructed by the Eurogroup, would punish us for being audacious enough to ask the Greek people to pass judgment on the ultimatum they had given us by shutting down the banks on Monday morning. And given that the referendum would take place on the following Sunday, after a whole week of banks that were boarded up and ATMs that would churn out a maximum of 60 euros per card per person per day, I had assumed, and I believe so had the Prime Minister, that our support and the no vote would fade exponentially. But the Greek people overcame fear. They set aside their pecuniary interests. They ignored the fact that their savings could not be accessed. And they gave a resounding, majestic no to what was, in the end, an awful ultimatum on behalf of our European partners.
Well, this will make it all the harder for him to push this through to avert the state bankruptcy. He's got to do it in a rush. Humiliation has piled on humiliation. Tax hikes, pension reform, spending cuts, etc. He can't win this, can he?
Well, this is indeed the politics of humiliation. The Troika have made sure that they would make him eat every single word that he uttered in criticism of the Troika over the last few years, 5 years. not just these 5 months, 6 months during which we've been in government, but of the 5 years prior to that. This has nothing to do with economics, Phil. It's got nothing to do with putting Greece back on the rails towards recovery. This is a new Versailles Treaty which is haunting Europe again. And the Prime Minister knows it. The Prime Minister knows that he is damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't.
Well, let's look at one of these things. One of the humiliations. Greece is to put 50 billion euros of state assets in a trust beyond Greek reach under European supervision to be sold off to pay down debt. This is just sovereignty is evaporating.
Well, you've been around long enough to remember the 1967 coup d'etat. You will recall that the choice of weapon used in order to bring down democracy then was the tanks. But this time it was the banks. The banks were used by foreign powers to take over the government. In 67 they used the tanks to take over the government. The difference is now that this time they're also taking over all remaining public property. They're putting it in a company that is going to be domiciled in Luxembourg. Remember LuxLeaks? And the Greek government is going to have to sell all of it according to a specified timetable, give 50% of it back to the Troika for repaying unpayable debt, use another part of it to recapitalize the banks without ever having any control over the banks. The banks remain completely under the control of the oligarchs who brought the country to its knees a few years ago. And only what if and when a few euros remain from these sales, and I can assure you that they won't, because the projected prices are just outrageously high, if that turns out to be untrue and a little bit of money is left, that money is going to go into some kind of public investment. But there will be none left. So this is, how shall I put it? You are right, it's a complete annulment of national sovereignty.
You've got some pretty good turns of phrases, tanks and banks. You've also come up with the notion of economic asphyxiation. Now, this asphyxiation has been going on steadily for almost 5 years.
That is correct. I call it something else too. You remember I used the term, which I think you liked a couple of years ago, fiscal waterboarding. So imagine that the Greek government's head is submerged in water, CIA-like, and then the moment it's about to perish, to die, it's allowed to come up for a gasp of air and pushed back in the water of fiscal austerity. This is done in a variety of ways, but what is going to follow in the next few weeks and months is going to be a far worse version of fiscal waterboarding, Philip.
Well, you may have some pleasure in the fact that Merkel's got a few problems with this, because if this manages to get through the Greek Parliament, there's no guarantee the German Parliament would allow Merkel and Schäuble to start talks on a bailout loan. Which is amazing, isn't it? We've been asked to effectively humiliate ourselves as a government, to introduce all sorts of bills that run completely against our mandate, on the promise that maybe the Bundestag is going to approve another bailout, which is going to make our debt even more gargantuan than it is, and our economy even less sustainable than it is. It is mind-boggling. I don't think that the European Union has ever made a decision that undermines so fundamentally the project of European integration. It's an outrageous defeat, not for Greece, but for the European project. And it was a defeat again of the European project that was dished out by the European Union. This is going to be remembered by historians in the future in exactly the same way as the Versailles Treaty was in 1919. It's a very interesting parallel. Now, you're not alone in being very unhappy with the backdown. I've named the Labour Minister in the introduction. So the majority is now looking very wobbly. Is it possible that a snap election could be on the cards?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. I haven't spoken to Alexis Tsipras. I will speak to him soon when he comes back. He's on his way back to Athens. as we speak. I just want to see what he's thinking.
Perhaps he won't come back. Perhaps he'll do a runner.
No, he's not the running type. He will come back and he will face the music. I just can't believe, from the extent that I know him, and I think I know him quite well, that he will stand in front of Parliament saying, well, this was the best I could do, vote for it. Maybe he will, but I would be very surprised if he does that. I would be very surprised if he wants to stay on as Prime Minister over this crime against Europe.
Schäuble has been less than helpful, of course. He came into the weekend talks expecting, and I quote, exceptionally difficult negotiations, saying the figures the Greeks submitted were not believable, while others were saying just the opposite. Can you explain why the finance minister seems to be seeking the dreaded Grexit?
I have a great deal of respect for Wolfgang Schäuble. I think he's the only person around the Eurogroup that has a plan. I've just written an article about this, which will appear in a German newspaper, Die Zeit, on Thursday. Look, Philip, let's be frank here. These are crucial moments, critical moments in European history, and I don't believe that we will be judged anything other than harshly if we don't speak out at this moment. Dr. Schäuble wants Grexit. He has been planning for it. He considers it to be an essential aspect of his plan for Europe, for a kind of political union that is now missing, a very specific kind of union, a disciplinarian one that is not a federation, but one that is based on the capacity of a single fiscal overlord to veto national budgets and therefore to annul national sovereignty. And he thinks that Grexit was essential for this, because a Grexit would create the fear in the minds and hearts of French and Italian politicians in particular to force them to acquiesce to the Schäuble plan.
So you're saying that Greece is simply a pawn on the board?
Well, it is. So what we have here is a major clash of titans between Dr. Schäuble on the one hand and Paris and Rome on the other. The Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has not committed one way or the other. And Dr. Schäuble, who's been around for a very long time, he's been here in the center of the Euro project from its inception. He's not happy with the way that the monetary union was not accompanied by a political union. He would like to have a federation, but he feels that he doesn't have the political power to create one. So he is going for what he considers to be, not me, what he considers to be the second best, which must, in his mind, involve a Grexit that will inspire sufficient fear in Paris and Rome, and possibly in Berlin too, in order to bring about that disciplinarian, negative political union. Negative in the sense that the overlord, the equivalent of the federal treasurer, will only have negative powers to veto national budgets, but not creative powers to transfer surpluses and to do a Marshall Plan, let's say. And the reason why I'm saying all this, Philip, is not because I have a theory. It's because Dr. Schäuble has told me so.
I have to stop the flow to tell everyone who they're listening to the voice of Yanis Varoufakis, who for many years has been our commentator on matters Grecian. And this is LNL on RN. You and I have joked, or I've joked, and you've been rueful about it, the idea of going back to the drachma. I was accusing you of secretly printing them in the cellar, and you made the point on our last conversation that you'd been required to smash the machines. Now, if you do have to create a new currency from scratch, you point out in a very fine essay, which I have in front of me, that in occupied Iraq, the introduction of a new paper money took almost a year, 20 or so Boeing 747s, the mobilisation of the US's military might, 3 printing firms and hundreds of trucks. What's happening? Is there a plan for this?
Well, let me be open and clear on this. The introduction of a national currency, you just read an example of how hard it is a nightmare. There's no doubt about that. Now, as a responsible government, knowing full well that there was a very significant alliance within the Eurogroup whose purpose was to throw us out of the euro, we had to make contingencies. We had to have a team, a small team of people, in secret, who would create the plan in case we were forced, not in case we chose, but in case we were forced to exit the monetary union known as the Eurozone. Now, of course, you realize that there is a conundrum here. Once this plan begins to get implemented, that is, you go from 5 people who are working on it to 500, which is the minimum you need in order to implement it, then it becomes public knowledge. The moment it becomes public knowledge, the power of prophecy creates a dynamic of its own, and then you're out of the euro before you realize it. We never made that transition from 5 to 500. We never felt we had a mandate to do this. We would never plan to do it. We had the design on paper, but it was never activated.
Yanis, the Economist at the weekend argued for a temporary Grexit. If the Europeans allowed the Greeks to issue scrip or temporarily to introduce an emergency parallel currency, Greece might in effect suspend its membership of the single currency without technically leaving. A fantasy?
Well, if it is a fantasy, it's also Dr. Schäuble's fantasy, because this is precisely what he proposed to me. This is what he proposed to me in a number of meetings we had. He called it time out. It's his expression. For us, it was a fantasy. The moment you begin the deconstruction of a monetary union, you are unleashing powers that you cannot control. And it takes incredible folly to think that you can control them. And this is why we rejected the proposal. It's a proposal that we would never have accepted as committed Europeanists. We believed that setting aside the very significant costs for the Greek social economy, that this kind of plotting, this kind of stratagems are part of the process of killing off European integration. And it's an outrageous defeat of the European project, as I said before.
Quite a number of the leading economists I mentioned earlier wrote their open letter to Merkel, warning, quote, history will remember you for your actions. Now, isn't she mindful that Germany was in an almost identical position after World War II and that the debt was forgiven?
Well, this is a question you have to pose to her, Philip. I had hoped that she would. Mind you, I've also been told by various German politicians and various German colleagues who are just as worried as I am about the impact of the last few months and years on European unity and Germany's position within a united Europe. I've been told that they decry the fact that the German political elite no longer contains somebody like Helmut Kohl, somebody like Helmut Schmidt, that is, leaders who knew it in their bones that toying with the integrity of the European Union for strategic purposes was running in the face of the historical duty to remember the Second World War and the great efforts put into bringing about European unity after the end of the war. And as you said, what happened after the war was that the United States of America decided that bygones are bygones. Germany had to be rehabilitated. You remember the speech of hope that was delivered by Burns in 1946 in Stuttgart, which effectively allowed the Germans to start believing again in a future in which their rewards would be commensurable with their efforts. This is what Greece has been asking for. I even wrote an article asking for a speech of hope that Mrs. Merkel could deliver in any city in Greece of her choosing. That would mark a magnificent turnaround in Europe. It would be the end of the Euro crisis and the beginning of a new phase of European integration. Instead of that, we had the politics of humiliation, and we had effectively terms of surrender being delivered to our prime minister, who was being told either you sign on the dotted line or your banks will never open again.
Angela Merkel as a dominatrix, Madame Lash. Now, I know you podcast the program from time to time. You might have heard us discussing the Argentinian default. And as you know, the warnings were dire that the country would spire into permanent crisis, hyperinflation, etc. That didn't quite happen. Is it possible, Giannis, that the effects of a Grexit are being overstated?
Well, up until now, my answer would have been no. But reading the document that was delivered to our Prime Minister and which he had to sign, or else, this particular set of proposals about Greece now guarantee that even if they're accepted by Parliament, and even if they're implemented fully, our social economy is going to fade, shrivel, and die. So I'm tempted to say that however awful Grexit might be, where we have reached now, the juncture in which we find ourselves now, is not one that allows me to reject the notion that the Grexit may not be the worst of possible outcomes. And also let me make an analytical point. At the moment, Philip, we already have a quasi-departure from the euro. If you were in Greece and you had your money in the bank, you wouldn't have access to it. You'd be able to shift it about using e-banking from one Greek account to another. You could make payments into other Greek accounts. But then you don't have access to it. You only have access to 60 euros of paper money a day. Now that creates, de facto, a dual currency system. I call it bank money, bank euros, and paper euros. You have bank euros, which are trapped inside the system, the banking system, and you have paper euros. And the two, very, very soon, are going to establish a kind of exchange rate between them. So we are in uncharted territory.
You mentioned the kernels in your opening statement. As it happens, I was in Athens that day. I was staying in a hotel on Constitution Square, and so my memory is haunted by the horrors of that era and the possibility that the political turbulence in Greece could lead to the same sort of terrifying polarities. It's something you and I have discussed before you took up your high post in Athens. Your concern has always been that there will be a surge of the ultra-right.
Well, when I go to Parliament, I have to look at the right-hand side of the auditorium where more than 10 Nazis sit representing Golden Dawn. If our party, Syriza, that has cultivated so much hope in Greece to the extent that we managed to score 61.5% in the recent referendum, if we betray this hope and if we bow our heads to this new form of postmodern occupation, then I cannot see any other possible outcome than the further strengthening of Golden Dawn. They will inherit the mantle of the anti-austerity drive, unfortunately, tragically. And therefore, I do seriously believe what I said to you before, that the project of a European democracy, of a united European democratic union, has just suffered a major, major catastrophe.
Oh dear. Yanis, thank you very much for your time, and our hearts go out to the Greek people. I've been talking to the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. Coming up, how future generations might feed themselves. They'll obviously have a wider choice of menu than the Greeks. LNL on RN.